To bring this special meeting at 4:30 to fruition. We need to do an executive session under CRS 246402, parentheses 4, parentheses B, legal advice, board to conference with an attorney for the purpose of receiving legal advice on specific matters. Can I get a motion?
Motion to adjourn, to go into executive.
Can I get a second?
Second.
Any conversation? Roll call, Monica, please.
Mr. Archuleta?
Aye.
Dr. Hyde?
Aye.
Mrs. Quintana?
Aye.
Mr. Rolla?
Aye.
Mr. Thomas?
Aye.
We'll go into executive session at 4:37. So let's move to the study session that was scheduled for 5:15. Let the record show at 5:31, we're going to move to the Building Excellence Schools Today Best Grant Application Update and Budget Goals.
Good evening, President Archuleta, distinguished members of the board, Superintendent Abrego. Thank you for letting me speak to you this evening about our plan. First, I'll talk about our plan for funding, and then you'll hear from Sheila and Gianni about some more of the updates on the BEST grant application process. Sheila has a packet, and in this packet, you'll find a copy of this presentation, and I apologize, you didn't have that in your original materials you received on Friday, so we'll go ahead and hand that out.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So for this first part of our presentation, what I'm going to cover related to the finance aspects of the BEST grant, I'm going to start by talking about our general fund balance, sort of looking at how much reserves there are, because we're talking about, potential use of them. And then we'll talk about waivers for the BEST grant and how that might at least initially look. Then we'll talk about the GFOA, and GFOA is the Government Finance Officers Association. We'll talk about a best practice that they've provided for the amount of your fund balance you might want to have maintained. And we'll look at a couple proposals for different ways we may be awarded BEST grants. And then we'll talk about the waivers again, and then we'll do kind of a best case, worst case scenario view. And then lastly, we'll talk about our recommendations at this point. So these numbers shouldn't be new. This is our audited 6/30/2017 general fund balance, and it's broken up into these categories. But generally, what you're seeing is there's 18 million in the fund balance in the general fund when we started this fiscal year. So starting last summer. So GFOA best practice for your general fund, they recommend you keep 2 months operating reserve at all times as a minimum. So what that calculates out to is, 2 divided by 12 is 17%. So 17% of our, and I'm using our next year's projected expenditure budget. This is an estimate. This is based on just taking a kind of snapshot and then increasing that a bit, knowing we'll have some extra costs we imagine will come down the pipeline. So 68 million. And then I'm going to multiply that by the GFOA recommendation of 2 months, and I get 11.3 million as a kind of recommended minimum reserve. So if you take our fund balance that we started the year with and you get rid of that minimum reserve, the amount you're left with is 6.7. So just to kind of have that in your mind when we're looking at that, that's a way to put that in a perspective. So when we've been looking at what we might expect to need to pay if we're awarded one of these BEST grants, one of the considerations has been we will try to apply for waivers, and you'll see up there that the CDE Regional Program Manager recommended we apply for waivers, and we may receive those. It could be between 10 and 90% of our match, so a significant amount, and we're going to work hard on that. Kind of at the same time, what we're hearing from our underwriter is that is maybe not the most likely scenario, and there's several factors for that, but without getting too deep in the details there, I think, a way to look at this is to say, you want to hope for the best and then plan for the worst. And this, I have my Stephen King quote there.
I don't understand, when it says CDE may waive, X percent of matching costs, how is CDE in a position to do that? I don't understand that statement.
So they have, they have funding from a couple different sources, but they have a pool of money. And what we're going to do is we're going to submit our application saying, we want to get a BEST grant, and they'll award that BEST grant. And typically, they have a amount that's kind of set by statute saying, and they release this publicly, saying you're going to need to pay 42% of whatever the cost of the building is, and your grant is the 58%. Now, in addition to that, what they've done recently, the last couple of years, is if they've found a district where they've thought that district cannot afford to make their match, that they've said, well, we'll go even deeper into our pool for you. And they'll use some more of that pool resources to try and get our match down, as much as 90%. So what I'm hearing from the underwriter is, they're going to look at the reserves. And they're going to look at our debt capacity. Can we go for a bond? There's, some state statutes about how much debt we can take on. And they're going to analyze that, and what they're going to see is that we have debt capacity, and they're going to see that we have some amount of reserve sitting there, and so we're probably not the ideal candidate for those waivers, but it could happen. We're going to try to get that.
Thank you.
So,
Eddie, let me help you out a little bit too, and I know he's not going to have enough time because we started a little bit late, but let me just try to help you just a little bit. If you look at your budget, we have about $68 million when we start. In the slide on page 3, it says we have 18 million in reserves. Okay, I'm just trying to simplify everything for you. The suggested on page 4 for reserves was 17%, which is 11 million. When you went to page 5, we really are doing better than that because we had much more than that. We have an extra 6 million beyond that in our reserves. And again, I'm going to ask the board, if you could let him go through it, I think he's going to answer most of your questions and then get him at the end because, Eddie, you're going to have to speed up a little bit
Okay.
and go through it.
Yep.
Otherwise, we're not going to get done.
Excuse me. Did we not put $5 million out of the reserves for legal? So that $5 million shouldn't be counted towards legal?
so
Is it
It shouldn't be
we-
counted, it was 5.
right.
If it was four, that shouldn't be in the
Right.
reserves, that should be somewhere else.
In last
So
year's-
it should be counted towards this.
In last year's budget, we did have a reserve for 4 million for legal. So the way we've looked at these numbers is we've said the GFOA recommendation at 2 months operating reserve is, sort of all inclusive of these things. So in addition to other reserve items, you might have a TABOR reserve, and you might have the board already designated a 5% reserve, and that these other reserves would be encompassed already within that GFOA number. So I guess my short answer would be that 5 million is included within the GFOA recommended reserve that we're including.
So if we need that 4 million out of that, say tomorrow, the numbers will change before they go to the CDE, correct?
That's right, if we suddenly did need that, but, we've looked at those projections and we feel at this point that we're not gonna need that reserve.
Thank you.
So they don't put it in a special, that particular 4 million?
It was a reserve within the budget.
Okay.
It was a budget line item. So to kind of examine our plan right now, if we are awarded just the best grant for ALSUP and we don't get a waiver, thinking that's likely, that estimated school cost is about 30 million. Best grant would cover 58. We have to come up with 42. So where do we come up with 12.6 million? We have Rosemary property proceeds in the bank now that could be used. We could use a portion of our general fund balance, that 2 million. Then what we're proposing is to use certificates of participation. So certificates of participation is, and I'll skip ahead. It's a form of debt. It's sort of, to give you a picture of it, it's like taking a mortgage on a building. So it's a form of debt. It doesn't require voter approval, and it's not going to increase their taxes. But that also means you don't get a source of new revenue. And the way we would have to make these payments is out of general fund every year. So ways that we could repay this early is, if we use this to build ALSUP on the old high school property, you could then sell the ALSUP property and use that to pay off your COP. You could take, if your general fund reserves continue to grow, you could take some of those general fund reserves in the future and pay that off. If we pass a bond in the future, we can put the certificates of participation into a bond as well. So these are ways we could look to, down the future, get rid of this debt so we don't have to make the payment out of the general fund. So what would the effect of these payments look like? So we have a similar payment we make already. This is for a Siemens lease. We have like HVAC and we have solar equipment on top of buildings. We currently make that payment every year. That's $280,000. We'll make that payment until 2021. So what we would do is we would pay interest only on the certificates of participation the first 3 years until we paid off that other lease. And then we would start making the full interest and principal payments. And this kind of makes an even feel to the payment. So right now what you're kind of feeling in the general fund is $280,000 coming out each year. And then once we had the certificates of participation, that number would jump up to $630,000. So that's a $350,000 increase every year that would be as a payment out of the general fund going to pay that debt. So what would our plan be if we were also awarded a best grant for ACMS and we didn't get a waiver? That school, we're estimating, this is an estimate, $35 million. Best grant would cover 58% of that. Our match would be 42%. We can't come up with this match on certificates of participation, and we don't think we should recommend that. So what we would say in that case is you have to go get a bond. We need to go to the voters, and they need to help us pay for our match here because we want to stretch the budget, but we don't have that. So let's go back and talk about the waivers a little bit. What if we did get these waivers? So if we get a waiver and a best grant for ALSUP and we get nothing for ACMS, then what I would propose we use that waiver for is to get rid of the certificates of participation. If we get a best grant for ALSUP and ACMS, but only the waiver on ACMS, then I would say you still need to keep your COPs because you've got to build ALSUP, but you could reduce the amount you're going to ask for in a bond from the taxpayers. So then to kind of move into this best case, worst case scenario, those kind of what you looked at there, and specifically the ALSUP plan is sort of the most likely. The best case is, let's say we get big waivers and we get grants for both of them. What might that look like? So school costs $65 million, again, an estimate. Our match would be 27.3. Let's say they waived half of that at 50%. You're trying to come up with 13.6 million. So it's your Rosemary property proceeds again, And here we've bumped up our use of the general fund balance to 3 million. And then we're proposing again certificates of participation, just like we were when we were saying the Alsop property, or the Alsop construction all on its own. So the payments here would feel similar to the scenario you already looked at. It's just that 7 million again. So I have a 3-year-old son, and he's just learning how to speak, and he speaks in kind of phrases and these bits and pieces of language he's putting together. And one of them he came up with is, "I have a great idea," and it's always some bad plan that he's cooked up, and then he runs out and does it and gets in trouble, and he comes back and he's like, "That was a bad, great idea." So this is the bad, great idea, or to use the plan for the worst. This is the worst to me when I'm looking at what kind of in the Stephen King world. What's your monster out there in this scenario? So let's say we get grants for both, but we don't get a waiver and we can't get a bond. What does that look like? So your school cost is 65 million. About our match is 27 million. We use Rosemary proceeds. We use our fund balance. Our certificates of participation at 20.7 million. That's huge. And our payment is going to be 2 million a year out of the general fund. I'm saying this is a bad, great idea. Don't do this. So, if we need one of those things to happen. So the way we have to manage that is the way we apply for the BEST grant and the wording that we put into it. So, what we'd like you to take away from this presentation is that, to increase the likelihood of approval. So I guess I have to back up a little bit and just say, why would we even submit the application saying it's not contingent upon a bond at all? So you could just take this whole idea of certificates of participation off the table, and you could say, we're not going to do anything like that. Then what you'd be looking at is you're either digging, below that minimum reserve in your general fund really deeply, and I wouldn't recommend doing that, or you'd be saying, it is contingent upon us going out to get a bond. So when we do that, the way the BEST grant CD staff is going to look at our application is it's less likely to get approved because we've said it's contingent upon a bond. So in order to kind of get ourselves in that better position, to actually be awarded that BEST grant, and particularly for Alsop, the way we'd like to write it is to say for Alsop it is not contingent upon us getting a bond, and we would be willing to use our reserves and the certificates of participation in order to be awarded that grant. So the way we would write is we would say if we're awarded, we can do that. We can do these projects without it being contingent upon a bond if we are awarded a BEST grant for just Alsop, or if we are awarded a BEST grant for both, but we receive large waivers on both. And I'm saying we probably have to put some sort of a percentage into there saying we can't afford, over this X percentage to keep it kind of within the calculations you've seen here. And I think you need to make sure, you're understanding that the plans we are writing into the BEST grant right now include the use of certificates of participation, which would be paid from the general fund annually, basically according to what I've shown you in this presentation. I also think you should have an understanding at this point that what we're proposing to do is use the Rosemary property proceeds in order to win that grant and then eventually pay for the construction of these buildings. And, to keep in mind kind of when we're looking out in the future of what specifically for those, to pay off the certificates of participation and then to move forward with money to buy property in the future to replace the kind of the Rosemary property proceeds, we'd be looking at selling Alsop and ACMS those properties to do those things. What questions can I answer?
Was included in the general fund the impact money? Do we still, I know it varies.
Yeah, I mean, that is calculated into there, the impact.
What's the average
aid.
we get from that, about? I know
I
it
think that's
varies from
about
year
3
to year.
million.
Yeah.
I think we budget about 2.3, but I think for this conversation, you know, you're kind of talking about a revenue side number, and you know, that the numbers up there, I think maybe that plays into the way we calculate that minimum reserve, but I would say that's in there. That's kind of an all-inclusive number. But, I mean, since you asked me, I would say that number, that minimum reserve calculation, you could calculate that a couple different ways. There's no specific guidebook of how you calculate that. So, you know, to Director Thomas's point, that could be, you know, you could say, well, you need to calculate that on top of the Tabor reserve, or you need to calculate that on top of a reserve for legal. What I've given is kind of my interpretation of the GFOA guidance, so that's a personal interpretation.
And Eddie, let me help you a little bit, because here's what I'm trying to simplify and make sure I'm saying it correct, because you said a lot. I'm going to try to do it in about 3 sentences. The district is going to be applying for the BEST grant. The BEST grant has to be submitted by February 23rd. In order for us to give us the best chances of getting that BEST grant, if we could show that we could do it without going for a bond, that's going to improve our chances, correct?
Right.
So you showed that scenario. So when we submit the grant, we're going to show that we can build Alsop School without a bond.
Right.
We're okay there. If we go for the 2 schools, we could still do that, but remember that Eddie said they can waive anywhere from 10 to 90%. If they were to do a number for us, like maybe waive 70%, that's a lot. That would look favorable to us. That'd be good. If it's a low number, then we just can't. Well, more than likely just 1 school, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so if we get a lot of money from them, we can go with the 2 schools, but more than likely, 1 for sure. That's what we were trying to accomplish here. And then in April, they're going to let us know how much if we were successful with the grant, correct?
Right.
And then once we get that, we'll know exactly how much money they're going to pitch in. And then once we have that, then we have to have continued presentations with the board to let them know how we're going to move forward.
Right, so in the next few days between now and the 23rd, we would bring the application to President Archuleta to sign.
Correct.
And beyond that, you know, we've gotten superintendent recommendations to the board already saying to approve us to apply using these methods of funding. So that's probably the kind of procedurally the piece you're going to see between now and the 23rd, and then after that, you know, we're expecting once we know were we actually awarded and what were we awarded, we would have to come back for additional approvals to move forward with any of these steps, like certainly the certificates of participation, and any of that would have to be approved then again down the line.
Yeah, we keep saying certificate participation, but for also, I believe the low end y'all said was 630,000, and if you do both schools, the low end would be another 630,000. The bad scenario was 2 million. So we're doing what, 1.2 million for the 2 schools at 630. So if we're doing that, I'm sure we have to do cuts within the district to pay that certificate of participation of the 1.2 million or the 630,000.
Yeah, we are not proposing anything beyond that initial ALSUP number. I presented a scenario to see what that payment, you know, might look like, and we talked about it, but it wouldn't be included in our application because we feel like we can't do that. We don't think that's a good idea.
But if it get approved, the school district will have to make a monthly payment, a yearly payment, approximately 630,000 from that presentation. So if we do that, we have to make budget cuts within the district to offset that 630,000.
Right. So what I was looking at, and the way I tried to present that there to say was that we're going to layer these payments. So we're going to layer it with a lease we currently have. That lease it's $280,000 approximately, and we're going to wait until that is paid off. And then once that's paid off, we would begin making that full payment of the $600,000. So what it would do is that means, this is a kind of the additional new ask you would see every year, which then we would have to figure out a way to accommodate within the budget. Whatever that may be would be $350,000 a year as opposed to the $600, the full payment. So, and kind of a perspective for what might that mean? Looking back in the last 2 or 3 years, the district has grown its reserves each year for several million. So, initially, without further guidance from the board, what I would say is, within that growth that we are seeing currently in those reserves, I think there might be room to make that payment without seeing additional cuts.
Thank you.
So I have a question, Eddie. The Alsop property and the Adams City Middle School property have a value. If we move to the high school property, have we checked into the price or the value of the high school property versus the Alsop and the middle school property? Have we done any of those calculations?
You can answer that.
Yes, we did look at the realtor that the district has used before in the past, and he's putting together a proposal. But speaking to him, he wanted to more kind of propose a contract for work, and we just needed some simple numbers. So I'm reaching out to other firms to see if they can give us a CMA, a comparative market analysis on the land and the value of it. I did receive something from another real estate firm on the old high school property, wanting to sit down and have some conversations, and they marked that property between 11 and 18 million, I believe, the value on that one. So I'm going to reach out to them as well. But I just didn't want to get the district into a situation where somebody was trying to get information to get a contract for services and be able to access those real estate fees. And so I'm just looking elsewhere for that answer.
Yeah, I appreciate that because, I know that both properties have a value,
Right.
especially with, what's happening with light rail and all of that stuff, and the city's proposed plan for moving forward. So, it's just a question for myself, they both have value. Which one has more value, and could we, if necessary, build Alsop on the Alsop property? I know that we would have to remove Alsop at that point in time. If we did that, it would be kind of chaotic.
Yeah.
But depending on what the millions of dollars would be for that property, it's something that
Yeah.
I think we ought to probably take a look at.
Talking to CDE, that was one of the scenarios we presented to her. She stated that because of the new light rail station going there and the tracks being so close, that it was more in our favor to relocate that school if that was a possibility, because the safety measures taking place moves us higher up on the scale for a possibility of receiving the best grant.
Okay. Well, thank you for doing that.
Yep.
You're way ahead of me. Do you guys want to go on?
Thank you. Is it the second presentation?
Are there any questions for Eddie? Thanks, Eddie.
Without further ado, we'll start our presentation. Good evening, President Archuleta, distinguished members of the board, and Dr. Brago. Our goal today is to update you on the, the progress up to date, answer any questions you may have at this point. In your folders, you'll find copies of each slide to take notes, and at the end of the presentation, we can answer any of your questions that you've jotted down. As you have seen before, this is our committee. assisting with the grant. Each member was chosen because of their knowledge and expertise. Now we'll go into the best grant timeline. Here you'll see the work that has been completed. Currently, we are on the last stretch of the February mark to submit the grant. I want to point out July, the timeline. It states construction begins. This is actually the beginning of the design process in the committee and the schools that will help with that design process. So construction will not start in July. That is just the committee getting together to design and move forward on that building. This slide shows the timeline once the application was started or opened. We are currently in the last stretch of week 5, and we'll submit in week 6. So Thursday next week, or is it Friday? Friday next week, that's when we'll have to walk down and present CDE with our application. As you can see, we're still using the 2010 master plan to drive our work. And we'll be submitting that copy as well with our application on the 23rd. This is the work that was done in 2010 by the district and the community to project where Adams 14 needed to be in the next few years based on the renovations and buildings that needed to be rebuilt. Honoring the work that the district and the community has done, we will continue to let this work drive our plans and our goals for the future. The assessment reports will also be part of the language we use in the application to stay consistent with CDE's suggestion on what we need to do with each of those buildings. Again, this is the data we use to determine the selection process for our schools. And as a reminder, each school will submit their own application independent from one another, and CDE will also evaluate each school's application independent of the other. As shown before, the 2 schools selected are Alsup and Adams City Middle School based on their Condition Facilities Index and their ranking based off those scores. The old high school property will be the new homes for each of these buildings if selected. Here's a possible rendering. You guys also have that rendering in your packet. Again, this is just a possibility. It can be adjusted in the design phase of the project, along with any ideas that come up from the committee and the community.
Which way is north?
This way is north, this is Brighton Boulevard here, and this is 69th. And again, these are just possible suggestions from the architecture firm that we've been working with. So this would be Adams City Middle School with parking here closest to the street. And then Alsup is over here. We have the green grass in between with the baseball fields and with a football field that would be CHASA regulated that also serves football and soccer. So you'll notice that the field is a little wider than our traditional field that we have here.
So part of the conversation when we look at working with this facility is, for instance, Dave, I'd probably ask you a question on that baseball field. Is that pointing the right direction, or should it be shifted another direction to keep sunlight out of sports players' face? This building over here, the educational side, the green piece towards Brighton Boulevard, we might want to pull that back on the other side and not so close to Brighton Boulevard. So those are some of the things in the conversations that are going to take place when it comes to the makeup of those buildings. So this is just a rendering. It doesn't have to look exactly like this. In the design phase, we'll come up with a more detailed concept of what that's going to look like. What's that? Yeah, and also these are 2-story structures. The green structures that you see there are two levels. So we're going up. It's cheaper to go up, and it saves space. And again, this is the communication plan that was developed to disseminate our plan of the best grant and information to the community. Again, our objective today was to update you on the progress thus far for the best grant and our final deadlines. Are there any questions?
Will the two existing buildings be demolished, or are they going to be used in that plan?
That would be part of the plan. The BEST grant will pay for demolition of that property, so it'd be in our best interest to take advantage of that opportunity.
When was the deadline for to put in the best
The
grant?
23rd. And we also put timelines in your packet, so you can follow along kind of what we're looking at. There is about a 4-month buffer in there as we work with the architectural firm as well as the contractor. So there is about a 4-month buffer in there for design and anything that comes up that may extend the time.
Are there any questions for Gianni? I do have one last part. I have board budget goals for 2017-18. These are from last year. I wanted to give them to the board because as we're moving forward for the goals for 2018-19, you may want to look at these. Mr. Ola, would you take one and pass them down? It's just something to look at, what we have. I'll wait till everyone gets one. Okay, and again, these were from 2017 to 2018, and that's what's going to guide our budget for the following year. So as we're looking at those for 2018-19, as board, you may want to look and see if you want to change any of those around, update them. You can see you have board goals for education. You have 4 of them right there. Promote culture and climate, have our schools accredited, have 100% of our students graduate, and implementing programs that are aligned, that are long-term and financial, academically stable. You have some revenue goals, 2 of them, and you have 5 expenditure goals. They're not set in stone. Those are the goals you had for 2017-18. So as we move forward, you want to give Eddie and our new finance person direction. And the other thing that you want to do too is after you look at these goals, I think you've given the superintendent some goals too. So make sure that the superintendent goals and these goals all support and complement each other. So that's just food for thought for as we move forward. Is there anything else that we can answer for you?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for all your hard work, both of you folks, for all 3 of you, for doing what you do. Hopefully we can get all the questions answered and continue moving forward.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Yeah, thank you. Did anybody else have any questions for Gianni and Sheila?
Or Eddie?
Well, Eddie was already asked him. Nobody questioned him. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, let's take a break. So our regular board meeting will start at 6:30, so we're going to take a break for about 20 minutes. If you need to use the restroom or anything, now's the perfect opportunity. Thank you.